Part 3 of Chapter 86 of The Adventures of Peregrine Pickle, Volume 2, by Tobias Smollett. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Martin Geeson. Chapter 86, Part 3. Dear Madam, the affliction of a contrite heart can never appeal to your benevolence in vain, and therefore I presume to approach you, in this season of delight, with the language of sorrow, requesting that you will espouse the cause of an unhappy lover, who mourns with unutterable anguish over his ruined hope, and intercede for my pardon with that divine creature, whom, in the intemperance and excess of passion, I have so mortally offended. Good heaven, is my guilt inexpiable? Am I excluded from all hope of remission? Am I devoted to misery and despair? I have offered all the atonement which the most perfect and sincere penitence could suggest, and she rejects my humility and repentance. If her resentment would pursue me to the grave, let her signify her pleasure, and may I be branded with the name of villain, and remembered with infamy and detestation to all posterity, if I hesitate one moment in sacrificing a life which is odious to Emilia. Oh, madam, while I thus pour forth the effusions of my grief and distraction, I look around the apartment in which I lie, and every well-known object that salutes my view recalls to my remembrance that fond, that happy day on which the fair, the good, the tender-hearted Sophie became my advocate, though I was a stranger to her acquaintance, and effected a transporting reconciliation between me and that same enchanting beauty that is now so implacably incensed. If she is not satisfied with the pangs of remorse and disappointment, the transports of madness I have undergone, let her prescribe what farther penance she thinks I ought to endure, and when I decline her sentence, let me be the object of her eternal disdain. I commit myself, dear madam, dear Sophie, dear partner of my friend, to your kind interposition. I know you will manage my cause as a concern on which my happiness entirely depends, and I hope everything from your compassion and beneficence, while I fear everything from her rigour and barbarity. Yes, I call it barbarity, a savageness of delicacy altogether inconsistent with the tenderness of human nature. And may the most abject contempt be my portion, if I live under its scourge. But I begin to rave. I conjure you by your own humanity and sweetness of disposition, I conjure you by your love for the man whom heaven hath decreed your protector, to employ your influence with that angel of wrath in behalf of your obliged and obedient servant, P. Pickle. This epistle was immediately transmitted by Godfrey to his wife, who perused it with marks of the most humane sympathy, and carrying it into her sister's chamber, "Here is something," said she, presenting the paper, "which I must recommend to your serious attention." Emilia, who immediately guessed the meaning of this address, absolutely refused to look upon it, or even to hear it read, till her brother, entering the apartment, reprimanded her sharply for her obstinacy and pride, accused her of folly and dissimulation, and entered so warmly into the interests of his friend that she thought him unkind in his remonstrances, and, bursting into a flood of tears, reproached him with partiality and want of affection. Godfrey, who entertained the most perfect love and veneration for his sister, asked pardon for having given offence, and, kissing the drops from her fair eyes, begged she would, for his sake, listen to the declaration of his friend. Thus solicited, she could not refuse to hear the letter, which, when he had repeated, she lamented her own fate in being the occasion of so much uneasiness, desired her brother to assure Mr. Pickle that she was not a voluntary enemy to his peace. On the contrary, she wished him all happiness, though she hoped he would not blame her for consulting her own, in avoiding any future explanation or connection with a person whose correspondence she found herself under a necessity to renounce. In vain did the new married couple exhaust their eloquence in attempting to prove that the reparation which our hero had offered was adequate to the injury she had sustained, that in reconciling herself to a penitent lover who subscribed to her own terms of submission, her honour would be acquitted by the most scrupulous and severe judges of decorum, and that her inflexibility would be justly ascribed to the pride and insensibility of her heart. She turned a deaf ear to all their arguments, exhortations, and entreaties, and threatened to leave the house immediately, if they would not promise to drop that subject of discourse. Godfrey, very much chagrined at the bad success of his endeavours, returned to his friend, and made as favourable a report of the affair as the nature of his conversation with Emilia would permit. But as he could not avoid mentioning her resolution in the close, Peregrine was obliged to drink again the bitter draught of disappointment, which put his passions into such a state of agitation as produced a short ecstasy of despair, in which he acted 1,000 extravagancies. This paroxysm, however, soon subsided into a settled reserve of gloomy resentment, which he in secret indulged, detaching himself as soon as possible from the company of the soldier, on pretence of retiring to rest. While he lay ruminating upon the circumstances of his present situation, his friend Pipes, who knew the causes of his anxiety, and firmly believed that Emilia loved his master in her heart, howsoever she might attempt to disguise her sentiments, I say, Thomas was taken with a conceit which he thought would set everything to rights, and therefore put it in execution without further delay. Laying aside his hat, he ran directly to the house of Sophie's father, and, affecting an air of surprise and consternation, to which he had never before been subject, thundered at the door with such an alarming knock as in a moment brought the whole family into the hall. When he was admitted, he began to gape, stare, and pant at the same time, and made no reply when Godfrey asked what was the matter, till Mistress Gauntlet expressed her apprehensions about his master. When Pickle's name was mentioned, he seemed to make an effort to speak, and in a bellowing tone pronounced, "Brought himself up! Split my topsails!" So saying, he pointed to his own neck, and rose upon his tiptoes, by way of explaining the meaning of his words. Godfrey, without staying to ask another question, rushed out, and flew towards the inn with the utmost horror and concern; while Sophie, who did not rightly understand the language of the messenger, addressing herself to him a second time, said with great earnestness, "I hope no accident has happened to Mr. Pickle." "No accident at all," replied Tom. "He has only hanged himself for love." These words had scarce proceeded from his mouth when Emilia, who stood listening at the parlour door, shrieked aloud, and dropped down senseless upon the floor, while her sister, who was almost equally shocked at the intelligence, had recourse to the assistance of her maid, by whom she was supported from falling. Pipes, hearing Emily's voice, congratulated himself upon the success of his stratagem. He sprung to her assistance, and lifting her up into an easy chair, stood by her until he saw her recover from her swoon, and heard her call upon his master's name with all the frenzy of despairing love. Then he bent his course back to the inn, overjoyed at the opportunity of telling Peregrine what a confession he had extorted from his mistress, and extremely vain of this proof of his own sagacity. In the meantime, Godfrey, arriving at the house in which he supposed this fatal catastrophe had happened, ran upstairs to Peregrine's chamber, without staying to make any inquiry below, and finding the door locked, burst it open with one stroke of his foot. But what was his amazement, when upon entrance our hero, starting up from the bed, saluted him with a boisterous exclamation of "Zounds! Who's there?" He was struck dumb with astonishment, which also riveted him to the place where he stood, scarce crediting the testimony of his own senses, till Peregrine, with an air of discontent which denoted him displeased with his intrusion, dispelled his apprehension by a second address, saying, "I see you consider me as a friend by your using me without ceremony." The soldier, thus convinced of the falsehood of the information he had received, began to imagine that Pickle had projected the plan which was executed by his servant, and looking upon it as a piece of unjustifiable finesse, which might be attended with very melancholy consequences to his sister or wife, he answered in a supercilious tone that Mr. Pickle must blame himself for the interruption of his repose, which was entirely owing to the sorry jest he had set on foot. Pickle, who was the child of passion, and more than half mad with impatience before this visit, hearing himself treated in such a cavalier manner, advanced close up to Godfrey's breast, and assuming a stern, or rather frantic countenance, "Harkye, sir," said he, "you are mistaken if you think I jest. I am in downright earnest, I assure you." Gauntlet was not a man to be browbeaten, seeing himself thus bearded by a person of whose conduct he had, he thought, reason to complain, put on his military look of defiance, and, erecting his chest, replied with an exalted voice, "Mr. Pickle, whether you was in jest or earnest, you must give me leave to tell you that the scheme was childish, unseasonable, and unkind, not to give it an harsher term." "Death, sir!" cried our adventurer, "you trifle with my disquiet. If there is any meaning in your insinuation, explain yourself, and then I shall know what answer it will befit me to give." "I came with very different sentiments," resumed the soldier, but since you urge me to expostulation, and behave with such unprovoked loftiness of displeasure, I will, without circumlocution, tax you with having committed an outrage upon the peace of my family, in sending your fellow to alarm us with such an abrupt account of your having done violence upon yourself. Peregrine, confounded at this imputation, stood silent, with a most savage aspect of surprise, eager to know the circumstance to which his accuser alluded, and incensed to find it beyond the sphere of his comprehension. While these two irritated friends stood fronting each other with mutual indignation in their eyes and attitudes, they were joined by Pipes, who, without taking the least notice of the situation in which he found them, told his master that he might up with the top-gallant masts of his heart, and out with his rejoicing pendants, for as to Mistress Emily, he had clapped her helm a-weather, the vessel wore, and now she was upon the other tack, standing right into the harbour of his good will. Peregrine, who was not yet a connoisseur in the terms of his lackey, commanded him upon pain of his displeasure to be more explicit in his intelligence, and by dint of divers questions obtained a perfect knowledge of the scheme which had been put in execution for his service. This information perplexed him not a little. He would have chastised his servant upon the spot for his temerity, had he not plainly perceived that the fellow's intention was to promote his ease and satisfaction, and on the other hand, he knew not how to acquit himself of the suspicion which he saw Godfrey entertain of his being the projector of the plan, without condescending to an explanation which his present disposition could not brook. After some pause, however, turning to Pipes with a severe frown, "Rascal," said he, "this is the second time I have suffered in the opinion of that lady by your ignorance and presumption. If ever you intermeddle in my affairs for the future without express order and direction, by all that's sacred, I will put you to death without mercy. Away, and let my horse be saddled this instant." Pipes having withdrawn in order to perform this piece of duty, our young gentleman, addressing himself again to the soldier, and laying his hand upon his breast, said with a solemnity of regard, "Captain Gauntlet, upon my honour, I am altogether innocent of that shallow device which you impute to my invention, and I don't think you do justice either to my intellects or honour in supposing me capable of such insolent absurdity. As for your sister, I have once in my life affronted her in the madness and impetuosity of desire, but I have made such acknowledgments and offered such atonement as few women of her sphere would have refused. Before God, I am determined to endure every torment of disappointment and despair, rather than prostrate myself again to the cruelty of her unjustifiable pride." So saying, he stalked suddenly downstairs, and took horse immediately, his spirits being supported by resentment, which prompted him to vow within himself that he would seek consolation for the disdain of Emilia in the possession of the first willing wench he should meet upon the road. While he set out for the garrison with these sentiments, Gauntlet, in a suspense between anger, shame, and concern, returned to the house of his father-in-law, where he found his sister still violently agitated from the news of Peregrine's death, the mystery of which he forthwith unravelled, recounting at the same time the particulars of the conversation which had happened at the inn, and describing the demeanour of Pickle with some expressions of asperity, which were neither agreeable to Emilia, nor approved by the gentle Sophie, who tenderly chid him for allowing Peregrine to depart in terms of misunderstanding. Chapter 86.